"Don't touch it," she whispered, and the barn kept the secret. The lantern flame shook and the hay looked like a dry ocean. Caleb roared knelt beside her and he moved like a man in church. Emma Lark pressed a palm to her ribs and her eyes refused to close. Her dress was torn and the tear looked older than today. Caleb reached toward the seam and she flinched like the world was a fist. Outside, a horse stamped once, and the sound felt like a warning. Inside, Caleb touched one crooked stitch and felt something hard beneath cloth. Emma whispered no again, and Caleb did it anyway, 'cause the wrong thing was inside. Then the town bell rang and the valley seemed to hold its breath. If you love slow-burning Old West stories, subscribe to Wild West Lantern Tales and keep that lantern lit with us. Tap like if you want more stories where truth walks in dusty boots. And tell me this, would you step back or would you have reached in? Anyway, the barn behind Caleb's house was a weathered box of pine boards and it held summer like a closed fist. Kansas heat had a way of turning silence into pressure and pressure into mistakes. Caleb had lived with that heat long enough that he could feel when it shifted. It shifted when storms were coming and it shifted when people were. That afternoon, it felt like both, and neither one felt forgiven. Emma lay on straw that scratched her skin, and she tried to hold herself still. Stillness was the last kind of control she trusted. And even that was slipping. Her cheek was pressed into dust and hay, and her lips were cracked from thirst. Dried blood marked her sleeve, and dirt clung to her like shame. She wasn't supposed to be here, and she knew it. The way a hunted thing knows a fence line. Caleb set a tin cup beside her hand, and the water trembled in it. He didn't push it toward her because pushing can feel like grabbing. He waited, and that waiting was its own kind of kindness. Emma stared at the cup like clean water had to be earned. Caleb kept his voice low because barns can echo and echoes can sound like orders. "It's all right," he said, and he didn't pretend it fixed anything. Emma's eyes flicked up and then away again like looking cold. Caleb knelt slow and his knee touched the dirt as careful as prayer. His hands were ranch hands, cracked and sun-worn and built for rope and rail. Still, he kept them gentle because gentleness was a choice he made on purpose. He soaked a cloth and wrung it out and waited for her breathing to loosen. When he touched the cut on her calf, she flinched and her mouth went tight. "Easy," he said, and he meant it like truth, not like control. Emma swallowed air, and it sounded too loud in the quiet. "Don't," she whispered and her voice caught on dust. "It still hurts there," she added, and her fingers tightened at her ribs. Caleb stopped moving and the pause was full of respect. "All right," he said, and he didn't lean closer. "Tell me where it hurts, and I'll keep clear of it," he said, 'cause choice mattered. Emma stared at the rafters, and her lashes didn't blink much. Caleb had seen that look before on a boy thrown from a horse and on a widow at a graveside. It was the look of someone who decided the world didn't deserve their eyes. Caleb cleaned the wound on her leg first, slow and steady, and he watched the water run clear. He wrapped cloth around it and tied a knot that didn't bite skin. Emma's breath hitched, then settled, then hitched again. Pain doesn't leave polite, and it doesn't care who's watching. Caleb finished the bandage, then leaned back on his heels and gave her space. The barn door creaked, and sun poured through a crack like molten brass. Emma shifted and the tear in her dress opened a little wider. That's when Caleb saw the stitch line and his stomach tightened. It wasn't a pocket sewn for coins and it wasn't a mended rip done with patience. It was a seam crooked and tight like somebody stitched in a hurry and wanted it to hold. Emma noticed his eyes and fear sharpened her face. Her hand flew to the tear and pressed it closed like she'd stop time. "It's nothing," she said. "Too fast, and speed is always a confession." Caleb lifted his palms and kept them where she could see. "I didn't come for your secrets," he said, and his voice stayed calm. "I came because you were bleeding and because nobody should bleed alone," he added. Emma swallowed and a bitter laugh tried to live in her throat. "That's not how towns think," she murmured, and she sounded older than her years. Caleb didn't argue because he'd seen towns think. A town could be a church one day and a wolf pack the next. It depended on who spoke first and who needed someone to blame. Emma shut her eyes and her shoulders tensed. Caleb waited because waiting can be the kindest thing a man does. Outside, flies buzzed and a far crow called once and the world kept going. Inside, Emma's hand shook and the shake wasn't from the heat. Caleb watched the tremor and remembered his own hands long ago. He used to wear a badge back when his spine was straighter and his faith in paper was stronger. Deputy folks had called him like the word meant protection. Sometimes it did, and sometimes it was just metal on a chest. He'd quit after a case that left a boy dead and a liar smiling. He'd quit because he'd learned something that didn't fit in any law book. A crowd doesn't need proof when it already has permission. Emma opened her eyes again and she looked right at him. "They hurt me," she said. And the plainness of it fell heavy. Caleb didn't ask who yet because names can turn a wound into a war. Instead, he nodded once and let the truth sit in the air. "I'm sorry," he said. And it wasn't the kind of sorry that tries to hurry past pain. Emma let out a slow breath and it sounded like surrender. "They said I deserved it," she added, and her voice tried to turn hard. Caleb's mouth tightened and he looked at the dirt because anger needed a place to go. "Men say that when they're afraid of what they've done," he replied, and his words tasted like old regret. Caleb stood and walked to a shelf and pulled down a small wooden box. The box was scratched and the latch was worn bright like it had been opened in heavy moments. He set it on a crate and he didn't open it yet. Emma watched the box and watched Caleb and watched the door. Hurt people watch exits even when nobody's chasing them. Caleb poured more water and set it beside her again. "Drink when you can," he said, and his tone stayed simple. "There's stew later and it'll put weight back on you," he added. Emma stared like food was another trap. Then her stomach betrayed her with a low sound. She looked ashamed and Caleb looked away because shame doesn't need witnesses. When she finally drank, her throat worked like it had forgotten how. Caleb sat on an upturned bucket and kept the space between them honest. He could have asked a dozen questions and each one would have been a hook. Instead, he gave her what most folks never think to give. He gave her a quiet room and the right to speak first. Later, when the sun slid lower, Emma pushed up on one elbow. Pain flared and she hissed through her teeth and then she went still. Caleb rose at once, but he didn't touch her and that restraint mattered. "You can stay as long as you need," he said, and he meant it. Emma stared at him like she was searching for the price. "Why?" she finally asked, and the question sounded tired. Caleb shrugged and the shrug carried a lifetime. "Because I know what it feels like when a place turns its back on you," he said. Emma's eyes narrowed because empathy can look like manipulation. Caleb didn't blame her for doubt because doubt is how survivors stay alive. Night came slow and the barn cooled just enough to remind the body it still had nerves. Caleb lit a lantern and set it near the door and left it there like a promise. He went outside and Emma heard him moving around the yard feeding his horse and checking the latch. He moved with the steady rhythm of a man who didn't spook easy. That calmness unsettled Emma because calm men had fooled her before. She didn't sleep much because sleep felt like giving the world permission. Instead, she watched the lantern flame and listened to the night breathe. At some point, a gate hinge squeaked and then stopped. Emma's fingers found the seam again and pressed hard over it. She slid toward the wall and held her breath because breath can be loud. Through a crack in the boards, she saw movement by the fence line. A rider sat still on a horse, and the horse didn't fidget like it was trained to wait. The rider didn't come closer, and that made it worse. Waiting is what predators do when they've got time on their side. Emma's mouth went dry, and she didn't call out to Caleb. Caleb's voice drifted from outside and he was whistling low like nothing had changed. That whistling made Emma's skin prickle because it meant the rider wanted only her to notice. A message without words and a reminder without a threat spoken. The rider turned after a long minute and rode away easy like he owned the road. Emma sagged and the lantern flame blurred and she swallowed a quiet sob. Morning arrived hot and bright and Kansas didn't bother with mercy. Caleb set a bowl of stew near the barn door and stepped back again. Emma ate slow and each swallow felt like the first time. Caleb sat a few paces away and watched the yard, not her. After a while, he asked, "You from around here?" And his voice stayed gentle. Emma shook her head and that was all. Caleb nodded like that answered enough for now. Quiet stretched and the quiet didn't feel sharp the way town quiet did. Still, Emma kept her palm on that hidden seam like it was a heartbeat. Caleb noticed because ranchers notice everything that trembles. By noon, dust rose on the far road, and Caleb watched it like a man reading smoke. A rider passed on the main track, slow and deliberate, and didn't turn in. Caleb's eyes followed the rider until the dust settled. "They found me," Emma said, and her voice was flat as dry land. Caleb glanced at her, then back to the horizon. "Maybe they've been looking," he replied. And he didn't say it to scare her. He said it because honesty is the only thing that doesn't rot. Caleb wiped his hands on his jeans and took a breath that sounded heavy. "You didn't get thrown out for being pretty," he said, and his tone carried certainty. Emma's face twitched because the truth stung as much as lies. "They said I caused trouble," she muttered, and bitterness crept in like smoke. "They said men lose their sense around me," she added. And her laugh was small and mean. Caleb snorted once, and there was tired humor in it. "Towns have blamed women for men's bad choices longer than fences have held cattle," he said. Emma looked at him, and something in her eyes shifted like surprise, trying to become trust. "What do you want from me?" she asked, and the question was sharp with caution. Caleb met her gaze and didn't blink. "Nothing," he said, and he let the words settle. "And I know how rare that sounds," he added, and his voice softened. That afternoon, Caleb fixed things that didn't need fixing. A hinge, a latch, and a loose rail. Men do that when their minds are circling danger, and they can't yet name it. Emma watched him work, and she started to understand the ranch wasn't as empty as it looked. It held history, and it held guilt, and it held decisions men bury under chores. When dusk came, Emma finally spoke again, and her words came out like splinters. They're going to come, she said, staring at the dirt like she didn't deserve eye contact. Caleb nodded once.